Hi everyone. Please be sure to have the review sheet for the first test and your textbook handy as you listen to this recording. I'm going to go through the list of bulleted items that are included on the review sheet and highlight some key points that I think are important related to those items. So starting with the first item, which is the law of demand. Okay, remember that when the price of a good goes up, people tend to buy less of that item, holding other things equal. All right, and when the price of a good goes down, people tend to buy more of an item, holding other things equal. All right, next point is factors that shift the demand curve. So we're talking about things other than a change in the price of the good that can cause the curve to shift. Remember that if the only thing that's changing about a good is its price, you actually get movement on that same demand curve. We have what you call, in that case, a change in quantity demanded. Now, if something changes other than the price, the curve's going to shift, and we refer to that as a change in demand. All right, so some of those factors that can shift the demand curve, all right, would include a change in income, a change in the prices of substitutes and complements, a change in taste and preferences, change in expectations, and a change in market size. Now, some factors that can shift the supply curve. Now, in a similar fashion, if the only thing that's changing about a good is its price, you actually get movement along that same supply curve, or what we refer to as a change in quantity supply. If something's changing other than the price of the good, then you actually would have a shift in the supply curve. And some of those factors that could shift the supply curve would include a change in the cost of the inputs used to produce that product, a change in technology or productivity, a change in taxes or subsidies, a change in price expectations. In other words, if you expect the future price of a good to be different, and a change in the number of firms in an industry. In other words, all those factors can actually shift a supply curve. All right, normal and inferior goods. All right, a normal good is one for which demand rises as income rises. And for inferior goods, all right, this is a case where the demand for goods falls as income rises. All right, price ceilings and price floors. All right, we had a good example of a price ceiling with rent control. All right, and this is a situation where the price is set at a level that's less than the equilibrium price, and the price can't rise above that level. All right, now with the price floor, you have a situation where the price for a good is set above the equilibrium price, and the price is not allowed to fall below that level. All right, now a good example of a price floor would be the minimum wage. All right, and one other point with respect to price floors and price ceilings. All right, first of all, with the price ceiling, all right, you tend to have shortages with a price ceiling because, like with the example of rent control, you have a situation where more people want apartments at the lower price, and you have less landlords that are willing to provide them, so thereby creating the shortage, okay, of the rental units. All right, and with the price floor, if you take the example of the minimum wage, you have a situation where more people want to work at the higher wage, and less employers are willing to hire them at the higher wage, thereby creating that surplus of workers. So you tend to have shortages with the price ceiling, and you tend to have surpluses with the price floor. All right, next item is price elasticity of demand, how to calculate. All right, your book gives you examples. I gave you a handout of examples of how to do that calculation. My suggestion would be to just review those, and it would be useful to include that particular formula on the little cheat sheet that you can bring into the test so that you remember directly how to do that calculation. You can just look for that formula on your cheat sheet. All right, next item is, where is demand elastic, unit elastic, and inelastic on a linear demand curve? All right, your book has an excellent example of that. It's actually on page 419 of your book. So if you take a look for that for a moment, you'll notice indeed that the elasticity is different, okay, at different points on that linear demand curve. So if you notice that demand tends to be what? More inelastic at the bottom of the curve, and as you move up that curve, demand tends to get to be more elastic as you move up that curve. So make sure that you take a careful look at that particular example on page 419. All right, determinants of the price elasticity of demand. All right, they include substitutes. In other words, how close are the substitutes for the good in question and how many substitutes are available. Another factor would be the share of the budget. In other words, the more that's spent on a particular item, the greater that person's price elasticity of demand will tend to be, and the converse is also true. And a couple examples will help here. Like for instance, let's say someone was going to buy a sports car. For most people, a sports car would eat up, okay, a large share of their budget. So therefore, we would expect the elasticity for a product like a sports car to be elastic, because it would use a good share of someone's budget. Versus if we take a product like table salt. If you went to the grocery store and you bought a box of table salt, that would cost probably around 75 cents. So for most people, that 75-cent box of salt would represent a very small share of someone's budget. So even if the price of that table salt went up a little bit, the price elasticity of demand for that product, okay, would tend to be inelastic, because that box of table salt represents such a small share of someone's budget. The time for adjustment is also another factor. You know, typically the longer the price change persists, all right, the greater the elasticity of demand, holding other factors constant. So a good example with this would be something like gasoline. All right, when the price of gasoline goes up, all right, in the short run, people, they still have to get to work, they still have to, you know, go about their business and their lives and whatnot, and they're you know, they have to buy gas, and there doesn't tend to be quite as much that they can do about that higher price in the short run. Versus, you know, in the long run, if that higher price were to persist, people might consider when their car wears out to buy the next car with a more fuel-efficient model. In other words, a model that gets a higher number of miles per gallon. So, you know, they could get more bang for their buck when they actually go and purchase the gas. There would be more options like that with a longer window of time when the higher price persists. All right, next item is cross-price elasticity of demand, how to calculate, how to determine if goods are substitutes or complements. All right, I gave you an example of how to do that calculation in the learning modules, so I would definitely take a look at that example. You might want to jot that formula down on your cheat sheet. And remember that if you get an answer that's positive, you're dealing with a substitute. And if you get an answer that's negative, you're dealing with an answer that's a complement. All right, income elasticity of demand. How does it differ from price elasticity of demand? All right, remember with income elasticity of demand, you're dealing with shifts in the demand curve, versus when you're dealing with price elasticity of demand, you're dealing with actually movement on the same demand curve. All right, next item is perfectly elastic and inelastic demand and supply. Well, first of all, it's helpful to think about what a perfectly elastic demand and supply curve looks like, and what a perfectly inelastic demand and supply curve looks like. Now remember, if the curve is perfectly elastic, it's going to be horizontal. If the curve is perfectly inelastic, it's going to be vertical. Some students remember this by thinking that the perfectly inelastic demand curve, given it's vertical, kind of looks like the letter I, and they correlate the letter I and inelastic together. In other words, they remember that the inelastic demand or supply curve is vertical. It looks like the letter I, and then think, okay, I and inelastic. They make that connection. That helps them to remember. In other words, to make that distinction between a curve that's perfectly elastic versus one that's perfectly inelastic. So if that helps you remember, might be a good tip. Okay, now a couple of examples here. All right, let's start with perfectly elastic demand. All right, if you have an individual firm under the market structure of perfect competition, all right, their demand curve is perfectly elastic. In other words, it's horizontal. People demand, an infinite amount of whatever good that is. Let's say it's corn, at whatever the current going market price happens to be. Now, if that individual firm were to choose to raise their price above the going market price, what you would find is that demand for that individual firm's product would actually fall to zero, because there are so many other vendors available that are selling that same product. It will be very easy for someone else to be able to go and purchase that product from a different vendor. All right, so if we were thinking about perfectly elastic supply, an example of that would be sand. All right, sand is, there's a vast supply of sand available. And computer chip makers actually need sand to be able to make, they need sand to make silicon that's actually used in computer chips. But we find sand as a product that tends, again, there tends to be a vast supply of it, and therefore we say that the supply is perfectly elastic or horizontal. And again, it's those computer chip makers, who need the sand to make silicon that's actually used in computer chips. All right, now an example of perfectly inelastic demand would be something like, let's say a person has diabetes, all right, and they need insulin to be able to survive. So someone's demand for insulin, okay, would be an example of perfectly inelastic demand. The reason being is that a person still needs that insulin, a certain amount of insulin, and even if the price goes up, the person would still need that same amount. It's just something that's essential for survival. Okay, so perfectly inelastic demand. All right, now an example of perfectly inelastic supply would be something like paintings done by a famous artist. And let's say the artist is no longer with us. The artist is dead. So for instance, paintings by Renoir, okay, they would have a perfectly inelastic supply. The price could go up, but there's no other way we're going to get more paintings by Renoir because, let's face it, he's not with us anymore, and so therefore he can't create any more paintings. So perfectly inelastic supply in that case. All right, relationships between total utility, and marginal utility. All right, if you look at your textbook on page 437, okay, you have a really nice example of that. So it'd be helpful to take a look at that example. All right, and here's a couple of relationships that are illustrated there to be able to keep in mind. For instance, all right, as marginal utility declines but remains positive, then total utility is going to increase at a decreasing rate. All right, when total utility falls, marginal utility is negative. All right, and when total utility is maximized, marginal utility is zero. And you actually can see all those illustrated in that example on page 437. Now that seems kind of complicated. All right, take an example that might be a little bit simpler. Okay, let's just let me talk through this one. All right, let's say that you like hot fudge sundaes. All right, and they're kind of a dessert of choice. So so you eat a hot fudge sundae. All right, and you get a certain amount of satisfaction that we say is measured in utils, which is just an arbitrary unit of satisfaction. All right, you get a certain amount of satisfaction from that. But let's say that you decide that you're going to have a second hot fudge sundae after the first. Well, chances are you're not going to get as much satisfaction out of that second hot fudge sundae as what you got out of the first one. So therefore, even though your total utility would rise by eating the second hot fudge sundae, your marginal utility would actually fall because you wouldn't be getting as much satisfaction out of the second hot fudge sundae as what you got out of the first one. All right, and let's say, for instance, that you even went ahead and had a third hot fudge sundae. All right, well, you got some additional satisfaction out of the third one, not as much as the second one, but some a little amount more out of the third one. Well, again, all right, your total utility would be rising, albeit at a decreasing rate, but your marginal utility would be falling because you were even getting less satisfaction out of that third sundae as compared to the second one. All right, and let's say with the third Sunday, okay, you've reached, your maximum total utility. All right, it's reached its highest point. All right, but for purposes of the example, all right, you decide that you're going to have a fourth hot fudge sundae. Well, if you eat the fourth one, all right, your total utility is actually going to go down, okay, because you already reached your maximum, total utility after you had your third one. So if you eat another one, your total utility would actually start to go down, all right, but in turn, all right, your marginal utility would actually at that point be negative. In other words, if your total utility is falling, your marginal utility is actually negative, okay, at that point. And, those relationships, all right, can all be seen, all right, if you take a look at those graphs that are included, all right, on page 437. All right, next item is know how to calculate consumer optimum. All right, your book has, an example. I've given you several examples in the learning modules. Take a look at those, all right, and just, familiarize yourself. Remember, how to, do a problem like that one, how to calculate consumer optimum. All right, advantages of the corporate form of organization. All right, there are a number of those, but one in particular to keep in mind is this whole notion of limited liability. In other words, you can only lose actually the amount that you've invested under the corporate form of organization. All right, next item is accounting and economic profit, how to calculate. Again, I've given you a couple examples of that within the learning modules. Take a look at those examples and note the differences between how to calculate accounting profit versus how to calculate economic profit. All right, and the next item is how to calculate present value. All right, again, if you look at the handouts that I gave you in the learning modules, I've given you several examples of those. Might be useful, look at a few of those examples. If it were me, I would just write the formula down on my cheat sheet. So, if you see a problem like that, you would have that formula handy in terms of how to do that calculation. How to define short run versus long run. Okay, remember in the long run, all factors of production can be altered. All right, next item is the relationship between diminishing marginal product and marginal cost. All right, remember that as long as marginal physical product rises, marginal cost falls. When marginal physical product starts to fall after reaching the point of diminishing marginal product, marginal cost will begin to rise. All right, let me say that again. As long as marginal physical product rises, marginal cost falls. When marginal physical product starts to fall, after reaching the point of diminishing marginal product, marginal cost will begin to rise. All right, next item. Where does marginal cost intersect the average total cost and average variable cost curves? All right, they do so at their respective minimums. Now, it's helpful to see this graphically. All right, so if you turn to page 490 in your textbook, you have a good example of that. All right, let's look specifically at panel C on page 490. All right, and you'll notice that that marginal cost curve is intersecting, all right, the average variable cost curve and average total cost curve at their respective minimums. And let's take a moment here also to look a little bit more closely, all right, at these curves. Because it's going to be important to be able to identify, which curve is which, okay, for purposes of testing. And if you notice here, all right, the average total cost curve and average variable cost curve, they almost have kind of a U shape associated with them. And also notice that the average total cost curve is sitting above the average variable cost curve. And the reason for that is that, remember, the average total cost curve includes both the variable costs and the fixed costs. So that's always going to be higher. Okay, the average total costs are always going to be higher than the average variable costs. All right, and then also notice how the marginal cost curve, you see there, it almost has a shape with it. It almost looks kind of like a check mark. See how it goes down and then it comes up. And then, of course, as we said a moment ago, how that the marginal cost curve intersects that average variable cost and average total cost curve at their minimum points. All right, and then if you notice the average fixed cost curve, see how it's falling kind of rapidly and then it continues to fall more gradually? over, a higher quantity of output. And the reason for that is that, all right, if, let's say a firm purchases a piece of equipment that's considered to be a fixed cost, and let's say it's expensive. Let's say it's a $50,000 piece of equipment. Well, that firm is going to want to produce more units of output, thereby spreading that fixed cost over, a larger quantity of output. And as it does that, what's going to happen is those average fixed costs, they're going to drop fairly quickly initially, and then they're going to continue to drop, but just not quite as fast as what they did initially. So, average fixed cost is where, you're spreading fixed cost over a larger quantity of output. All right, next item is, the relationship between average total cost, and marginal cost. All right, and again, you can see this illustrated, in the graph on page 490, panel C. All right, when marginal cost is less than average total cost must fall. Say that again. When marginal cost is less than average total cost must fall. And you can see that illustrated in the graph. Look for that. All right, when marginal cost is greater than average total cost must rise. When marginal cost is greater than average total cost must rise. And again, you see that illustrated in that graph. If you just hear the words, it's one thing. You have to hear the words and look at the picture, and you can see those relationships, in that picture. All right, where is the minimum efficient scale on a long-run average cost curve? All right, again, it helps to be able to see this graphically. Let's take a look at page 500 in your textbook. All right, this is figure 22-6, and you'll notice there, it's the point at which it reaches minimum cost. All right, in other words, where that curve goes flat. In other words, where those costs are constant, where that starts. All right, and that's considered to be your minimum efficient scale. In that particular picture, that's labeled as point A on the graph. Okay, what does the demand curve look like for an individual firm in a perfectly competitive market? Okay, remember, it's going to be perfectly elastic. Okay, horizontal, perfectly elastic for an individual firm in a perfectly competitive market. All right, when does a perfectly competitive firm maximize profits, and what is always true at that level? All right, this is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. In other words, where MR is equal to MC. Okay, that's where the perfectly competitive firm is going to maximize profits. All right, for the next two items, let's move to page 516, in the textbook. All right, and we're going to take a look at figure 23-5. All right, and the first of those two items says, when should a perfectly competitive firm shut down in the short run? All right, and what's true is that as long as the price per unit sold exceeds the average variable cost per unit produced, that firm should stay in business in the short run. But if the price per unit sold is less than the average cost per unit produced, it should shut down in the short run. So as long as the price per unit sold exceeds the average variable cost per unit produced, it should stay in business in the short run. But if the price per unit sold is less than the average variable cost per unit produced, it should shut down in the short run. Now, you can see in that graph, the shutdown point is labeled as point E2, okay, in that picture. And for some students, that point is a little bit complicated to understand. But here's a simple way, I think, to try to remember this. All right, for many firms, labor is considered to be a variable cost. So if you keep in mind that to stay in business, what this is saying is that the price per unit sold has got to exceed, okay, the average variable cost per unit produced. All right, so if a firm has a price that's high enough to be able to cover those average variable costs, all right, it should stay in business. So if labor is a variable cost, In other words, as long as the firm is making enough money to be able to pay its workers, it can stay open and stay in business. But if the firm, let's say, all right, its price per unit, all right, isn't covering its average variable cost. It's not covering its labor costs. The firm doesn't have enough money to be able to pay its workers. All right, if the workers aren't going to get paid, they're not going to come in. All right, so the firm's going to have to shut down regardless, because it can't charge enough to be able to cover that variable cost. It can't. It's not bringing enough money to be able to pay its workers. So it's going to have to shut down, okay, no matter what. So a lot of times when people think about it that way, it helps them to say, oh, yeah, okay, if we can't, labor's a variable cost. We're not even charging enough to pay our workers. Workers aren't going to come to work. How are we ever going to open up? We're going to have to shut down, okay? That seems to help this whole point to make sense in terms of why the business would have to shut down. All right, but then, all right, if we go to the next point there, what's the short-run supply curve for a perfectly competitive firm? All right, that is the marginal cost curve at or above the point of intersection with average variable cost. So if you look at that section of the marginal cost curve from E2 going up, all right, that is your short-run supply curve. Because remember, you're not going to produce below a level of E2, right? Because if you go below E2, you're going to have to shut down. If you're charging a price that's less, okay, than that, then you're going to have to shut down. So in other words, the short-run supply curve there is represented from E2 and above on that marginal cost curve. All right, and what happens in the long run when a perfectly competitive firm experiences economic profits? All right, well, that's a positive development. So firms are going to enter the industry. All right, more firms producing a good is going to increase the supply. And remember, when supply increases, what happens to the price? All right, the market price is going to fall. Market price is going to decrease, all right, in that situation. All right, so as you review for the test, go through the review sheet, listen to the recording, as you're reviewing other things. If you have any other questions, just send me a message. I'll be happy to answer, any other questions that you may have. And just make sure you review carefully. And again, any questions, I'll be happy to answer those.